And now to talk more about this, we welcome Mr. Matthew Boms, climate expert and the international manager of the Climate Reality Project. How are you, Matt?
Good, thanks for having me.
No problem. And now, straight to questions. Trump said regulation rollback is a number of regulations he intends to avoid for the purpose of job creation. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so we've seen at the Climate Reality Project, we were founded in 2006 by U.S. Vice President Al Gore, and our mission is to spread climate change awareness and education throughout the world. The way we see it, these are the latest set of legislation on energy. Under the Clean Air Act in the United States, carbon dioxide is officially considered a pollutant. So the Supreme Court has actually ruled on this, and it's considered not only a scientific fact, but the government considers it a fact as well. The latest actions taken by President Trump would effectively roll back Obama's regulations that limited the carbon dioxide emissions from coal plants in the United States under the guise of job creation, right? At the Climate Reality Project, we understand very well that job creation happens from building new solar and wind energy farms. And that's happening already, not only across the United States, but across this region in Southeast Asia.
I want to touch on Southeast Asia in just a little bit, but before we go there, Trump vowed to save the coal miners in Pennsylvania and Ohio just before the voting finished. Now, how do you see that, and does that really help the economy there?
Yeah, so we've taken a long-term view at all of these statements, right? And we've seen a lot of political changes over the years, but our mission has still been the same as far as the science of climate change. When these promises have been made as far as coal energy, the jobs that coal would create for American workers, we see the scientific facts and the reality behind the economics. Solar energy, for example, over the last 4 decades has declined in cost, right? So we've seen it decline by over 1,000% in that amount of time. 1 watt of solar energy is now well below $1 per each watt. So a statement like coal plants will create jobs for American workers is just not true, because coal energy doesn't quite compete with solar and wind anymore.
Now that's in the U.S. What about like here in Southeast Asia? I know that solar energy is a new type of renewable energy. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So on the free market, solar and wind are absolutely economical and absolutely competing with coal, oil, and gas. In some places that is more expensive, depending on the subsidies that governments are giving, depending on the support that it has from that actual market share. So I can't speak to individual governments, but I would say that depending on government policies, there are absolutely a plethora of options available for renewable energy.
Back to the U.S. just a little bit. Paris climate agreements. If the U.S. were to pull out from that, what are the consequences for U.S. and the world?
Yeah, of course. So I would say this, that now the power is in the state hands and in the city government hands. And what we're seeing in the United States is a movement of states and city governments. We've seen, for example, the governor of New York and the governor of California collaborate with each other and come to an agreement on 50% renewable energy by 2030. And those kind of agreements are giving us hope, because it shows that state governments and city governments aren't waiting for the federal government to act. They're actually moving quite progressively.
But if there is an executive order from the federal government, things would be held back. Wouldn't you say so in this situation?
Yeah, and we're definitely fighting for that. We have about 11,000 climate reality leaders around the world that have attended trainings from U.S. Vice President Al Gore, and that includes about 300 here in Indonesia. Okay. So yeah, we're fighting that. We're taking it seriously. But on the other hand, we have a system of government. It's not just a president, right? We have legislative branch, we have the judicial branch. Ultimately, the Supreme Court gets to decide whether these are in line with the Constitution.
Trump labeled global warming a hoax by the Chinese to wipe out American jobs. Tell us the data and the statistics about that. How you see that?
Sure, yeah. So 14 of the last 15 years on record have been the hottest we've ever seen, right? So I mean, that alone should give you a pretty good idea that climate change is happening pretty quickly, right? The parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now well above 400, right? And we consider 350 to be the threshold where human beings can survive on this planet, right? The temperatures just keep rising. To give you an example, Typhoon Haiyan, Typhoon Yolanda that hit the Philippines, the ocean temperature was several degrees above normal when that typhoon hit the Philippines. So his statements on climate change just aren't accurate, and we're seeing the science and the storms that are happening currently.
But about the Indonesian government, we know there's a lot of forest fires still going on, even though President Jokowi did agree to reduce emission by 40% by 2020. Are you optimistic about it or not?
Yeah, and Indonesia is making great progress on their commitment on climate change. Considered a pretty bold commitment, actually, on the international stage. And what we'd like to see is more renewable energy, right? Because we know this is the future, this is where the market is heading. This is something we've been talking about for the last 11 years, and we've built a solid foundation of activists on the ground that are pushing for renewable energy. Indonesia is unique because, like you mentioned, the forest fires and deforestation are the major contributors to climate change in Indonesia. And actually, in 2015, Indonesia was the #4 country for contributing to climate change on an international stage. So yeah, I mean, we're doing our work on the ground. We're making sure those forest fires are contained, and I think the government is already doing a great job.
What would you push if you were in the government to sort of make this even go faster, if you were in the government?
Yeah, for sure. So what we're supporting basically are sensible policies behind renewable energy, right? We know for a fact that solar and wind energy can solve the problems that we're facing behind the climate crisis. Okay. So most of all, governments can really provide subsidies for those energies to kind of take shape. So instead of supporting sort of 19th and 20th century technologies like coal plants, they can move to the future and kind of leapfrog ahead and support those renewable energies.
Okay. I just read a story about how rich countries are outsourcing their CO2 emissions to developing countries. How true is that? And give us, the audience at home, of what is really going on and how it works.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of these, a lot of manufacturing the consumption that we're creating in the United States, for example, a lot of it's outsourced to other countries for cheaper labor, right? And those carbon emissions are officially labeled as those developing countries, right? Because that's where the emissions are taking place. So under the Paris Agreement, each country has a commitment they have to make, but the question is, where do those emissions actually come from, right? If the consumption is happening in a developed country, but the manufacturing is happening in a developing country, it becomes a social justice issue, right, of who is responsible for those emissions.
All right. Before we go, I'd like to tell us about your recent program. I believe you're doing something in Kalijodo. Tell us about that.
Yeah, for sure. So we're doing a ton of work here in Indonesia. Our annual youth leadership camp has been really successful, training over 1,500 young people on the science of climate change. Indonesia has some of the most active leaders on climate change in the entire world, and we couldn't be more proud of them. There's more information on our website, climatereality.org.id, and there you can find more news and more information on climate reality.
All right, Matt. We hope for the best, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
All right.